of you today. And can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share, so I'm just going to share my screen here. Sorry, just bear with me a second here. It looks like I need to change some settings on my computer.
You're fine, take your time. Actually, it's a good time for me to ask. I have someone that's joined us by the number 740-918-9700. If you could just indicate your first and last name in the chat box, we want to make sure you get credit for today's session. Doing okay, Kate?
I think so. Let me try that again. All right, can people see that PowerPoint? Okay. All right, so as April mentioned, today I'll be talking about tools for clinicians and community members for better understanding and also affirming the LGBTQIA+ community. So in terms of what we'll be talking about today, we'll start by just looking at terms and definitions relevant to LGBTQIA+ identities. And then we're going to discuss etiquette surrounding pronouns and name usage for trans and non-binary folks. And then we will look at stigma, health disparities, and trauma facing the LGBTQIA+ community. And then finally, we'll end by talking about ways of providing trauma-informed, affirming care and support for the LGBTQIA community. So as I said, we'll start just by talking about some terms and definitions, just kind of the basics of LGBTQIA+ identities. So just want to start off by just kind of going over what each of those letters and the acronym means, just in case there's anybody who's not familiar with that. So the L refers to lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, T for transgender, Q for queer, I for intersex, A for asexual, and plus just to include all the wide variety of identities that folks might identify with. So you can think of the LGBTQIA+ acronym is kind of an umbrella, and it's broken down into sexualities and genders or sexes. And oftentimes, folks will use the word queer kind of just as that umbrella term to denote that some part of their identity or multiple parts of their identity fit within that LGBTQIA+ acronym. So on the sexuality side of things, that would be, for example, lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, and then examples of genders or sexes would be transgender or intersex. And I do want to note that the word queer as an identity label, it's something that tends to be kind of sometimes generational in terms of folks identifying with that label. And so, you know, some folks, especially older folks, they might still kind of view queer as a slur or as a negative word. So it's definitely something that you wouldn't want to use or identify someone as without them having done so first. But for example, like I prefer to use the queer label for myself, just because it's kind of a nice umbrella to describe all the different intricacies of my identity, rather than having to go on for 10 minutes about about all the different ways that I identify. A definition of what sexual orientation means. So basically, it's your sense of personal and social identity. It's often based on 3 components. So who you're sexually, romantically, and or emotionally attracted to. It could include the behaviors through which you express or act on those attractions. And then it also includes a sense of belonging to groups or communities that share those identities. So it might include, identifying with the queer community or the LGBTQ community. And so it's important to note that sex, gender identity, and gender expression are all different constructs. So sex is the label that typically one is assigned at birth, and it's usually based on physical characteristics like hormones, chromosomes, reproductive organs, and secondary sex characteristics. And then that differs from gender, and that gender looks at your identity and your expression of gender. So gender is kind of more interior. It's your privately experienced internal sense of self and how you feel about your personal gender. And then expression would be your kind of how you express your gender, typically within the ways that our culture identify things of masculinity or femininity, or outside of those stereotypes, or rejecting those stereotypes. So this is a tool that was developed by some folks to just kind of help people think about their gender and their who they're attracted to. So this is something that you could fill out for yourself if you work with clients. And you have a client who is kind of exploring their identity. You could work on it with them, or just anybody in your life who that might be exploring their identity or working to better understand themselves. This could be a helpful tool for them. So here's an example of how somebody might fill it out. So that first kind of like turquoise, blue, green section for gender identity. So it might be, is somebody's gender female, woman, or girl? So for this person, their identity is very much on the high spectrum end of identifying as female or a woman, and then lower in terms of man or other genders. And then you have in the green section, gender expression. So the way that you express your gender, it could be like what you wear, or the things that you do, or how you wear your hair, for example. So for this person, they tend to incorporate lots of femininity in their expression, a medium amount of masculinity, and then a little bit less of that other category. And then you have the sex assigned at birth. So this person was assigned male at birth. And then also you have physical attraction and emotional attraction. Physical attraction, you can also think of that as sexual attraction, and then emotional attraction can also be thought of as romantic attraction. And so one thing that I like about this gender unicorn is that it has all of these different categories under identity and expression and attraction, and a spectrum for each of them. So you can be somewhere on the spectrum for all of them. So for example, like having attraction to women and men and other genders, you can kind of just represent that whole slew of how someone might identify. And so this particular example, this would be an example of somebody who is transgender and that they were assigned male at birth, but is a woman or female. So I also want to talk about the gender binary. So this is a kind of a very deeply ingrained construct that there are only two genders, and those are based on the two distinct biological sexes that we tend to identify. So it would be male or man and female woman, just kind of seeing as those are the only two categories, and folks either fit into one of those two categories. And so it starts off from birth. Infants are usually categorized as male or female based on their external genitalia or chromosomes. And you also hear examples of this gender binary, even when we talk about transgender folks, and if they decide to transition, we talk about, transitioning to the other sex. Or you also hear it when folks talk about like the opposite sex, for example. That would be an example of this construct of the gender binary. So outside of this, we have the non-binary gender. So this would refer to a non-cisgender person. And so cisgender would be somebody whose gender aligns with their sex assigned at birth. So if you were assigned female at birth and you recognize later on in life that you are a woman, then you would be cisgender. So somebody who's non-binary with their gender would be a non-cisgender person who has a gender identity that falls either somewhere outside of the male and female identities or somewhere in between. It could be somebody who it floats back and forth between man and a woman, or kind of has that more fluid gender identity, or maybe they don't experience having a gender at all, or they reject having a gender identity. So it's important to note that some non-binary folks, they do identify as transgender, and some don't. So it's important to not assume labels. So if you, for example, talk with somebody who's non-binary, it would be important to not just assume that they would identify as transgender or choose that label for themselves. So similar to the label queer, non-binary is also kind of an umbrella term, and there's lots of different identities that can fall under that label. So you might have heard the term genderqueer. There's also agender, so that would be folks who just feel like they don't have a gender or don't identify with any gender. There's also gender non-conforming that can fall under this umbrella term. Two-spirit is another gender label. This is, you might hear this more commonly in Canada. I believe that their acronym, like the LGBTQ acronym, typically includes a 2 in it for two-spirit. Pangender could also fall under this. Bigender, gender fluid, transfeminine, and transmasculine. So there's lots of different terms that folks can use to label their gender, or it just depends on, what feels right to them, what feels like it most fits with who they are and their experiences. And it's important to honor that. So I also want to talk about pronouns. Pronouns are important to consider because we don't want to misgender folks. And so misgendering happens when you refer to or address someone in a way that doesn't match their gender identity. So for example, if somebody uses he, him pronouns and somebody used she, her pronouns for them. That would be an example of misgendering. And so it's okay to make mistakes, but if you do so without acknowledging it or apologizing to the person, this can really have a big impact on the person. And if you are a healthcare provider or a clinician or anything like that, this can really make them feel very uncomfortable in that setting, and also make them potentially uncomfortable with seeking other services in the future. So the best practice is when you meet someone to ask for their name and pronouns before addressing them with any gender-specific language. And it's also important to do this regardless of whether or not they appear to be transgender, because the fact is that transgender folks can look like anyone, and it's not up to us to decide who looks like they're transgender and who doesn't. So, like I said, if you don't know somebody's pronouns and haven't asked, it's important not to use any gender-specific language. So there's a couple of ways that you can ask for somebody's pronouns, and it just depends on what works for you, what you decide feels the most natural to you. So for example, you could just ask very straightforward, what are your pronouns? You could also ask in another straightforward way, what pronouns do you use? And then also, if you want to just kind of introduce why you might be asking somebody's pronouns, you could just say something like, I would like to refer to you respectfully, and then ask them simply, what are your pronouns? So one thing that I want to note with these ways of asking what somebody's pronouns are is that some folks have maybe had training or have heard of asking your preferred pronouns, or asking someone, what pronouns do you prefer? When you use the word prefer, it kind of just implies that it's just a preference, and that if I knew that somebody preferred to use she, her pronouns, then I would know that that's what they prefer, but that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to use those pronouns with them. So it's important to just ask what somebody's pronouns are, because they just are. Those are their pronouns. It's not a preference for them. Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
We have several people that are very interested in all of this information that you have and would like to have a copy of your PowerPoint.
Sure. Yeah.
Possibility. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everyone is taking notes frantically, and I just wanted to be able to give them an opportunity to kind of relax and take in the information and know that it will be provided to them. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to share this information, this PowerPoint, and also let me know if I'm going too fast over anything, or if you want me to go back to something, and I would be happy to do that. And I believe we'll also have time at the end for questions too. So we were talking about pronouns and just the importance of acknowledging that it's not a preference, it's just the pronouns that somebody uses. And as also similar to that, you might have heard the term sexual preference for sexual orientation, and there's probably aware that term sexual preference is kind of outdated now. We're able to recognize that it's not a preference who you're attracted to. So it's the same kind of thing with pronouns. So here's some examples of pronouns. There's a little chart here with the subjective, objective, and possessive. So for example, you have he, him, his, she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, And then the bottom three are some that maybe you might be less familiar with, but that lots of folks feel more comfortable with using these pronouns. So that fourth one there, it's sie, hier, hers, and then sie, them, their, and I am, er for that final one there. So it's just very important to ask what pronoun somebody uses and to not make assumptions about that. So I also want to talk about names, just because some folks don't identify with the name they were given at birth, and they might choose a new name that reflects their gender identity. And so it's just always important to refer to someone by the name that they give you or the name that they indicate. As it can be really difficult or uncomfortable, maybe even traumatizing for somebody who is trans, and they have a name that better suits their identity, and then you refer to them by the name that they used to go by or the name that they were given. Maybe you've even heard the phrase dead naming. That's a term that's often applied to when folks call somebody by the name that they were given when they were younger, that they don't use anymore. So now I want to talk more about some of the trauma disparities that folks in the LGBTQ community experience, and just kind of take a closer look at that. So LGBTQ people, they have experiences with being marginalized in society. They might experience discrimination, and just the general stress associated with being a minority. And these can all lead to higher levels of trauma symptoms amongst this population. And so the DSM, the book that psychology or mental health uses to diagnose folks, doesn't specifically include homophobia or transphobia as risks for trauma, but the everyday exposure that folks in the LGBTQ community face to that discrimination, marginalization, and stress can definitely put people at a higher risk for having PTSD. And so it's also important to note that although the public acceptance of LGBTQ folks seems to be at an all-time high these days, you know, throughout your lifetime, you've probably noticed that there's been lots of changes. I've certainly noticed lots of changes, like even in the past 10, 15 years or so. There still is a very long history of interpersonal and systemic homophobia and transphobia in the US that still does remain. And also just knowing that history that's there, that can also just be something that folks carry with them, just kind of having that history and the way that their community has been impacted over the years by that. So for example, things that are that the LGBTQ community is still facing. So you're probably familiar with some legal battles that are still happening about questioning, is it legal for folks to refuse to serve an LGBTQ person at their business because it goes against their religion, is what they might say. And you also might be familiar with how homosexuality was still labeled as a mental illness in the DSM until the mid-1970s. There's also the history of the way that HIV and AIDS was stigmatized and neglected by US leaders. Other things that are still currently going on today, conversion therapy, which is a supposed treatment that seeks to change folks' sexual orientation or their gender identity. That's still legal in many places, despite evidence of it not being helpful, and the evidence actually suggests that it's harmful. And then also, there's statistics that say that trans folks account for over 10% of all hate crimes in the US, despite being only 0.3% of the population. So it's clear that there's just a number of acts of homophobia and transphobia that folks in the community are still continuing to face today. And then there's also, so there's kind of like bigger, higher level discrimination or that they might experience. And then there's also microaggressions that they might experience. So those can be interpersonal or systemic microaggressions. And so in case you're not familiar with what a microaggression is, those are just everyday slights, indignities, put downs, or insults that marginalized folks experience in their daily life. So some examples of microaggressions. Folks might experience others being uncomfortable or disapproving of the LGBTQ experience. So it just might be, somebody who is judgmental or just kind of conveys that they don't support that. So an example of that would be like a coworker who says that they're not interested in hearing about a female coworker's marriage to a woman, their wedding, even though that same coworker consistently asks about the weddings of other coworkers who are straight. So that would be an example of that. Another microaggression would be just assuming that there's some kind of universal experience of being LGBTQ. So that would basically just be like stereotyping. So like example, assuming that like all gay men know a lot about fashion or like female music singers or something like that, just assuming that everybody who falls under that identity is interested in the same things or does the similar things. There's also exoticization as a microaggression. Another word for that would be like tokenism. Just kind of like just like you might have heard of like the trope or the stereotype of the gay best friend. It's something that you might see in the media. That would be an example of that. There's also use of homophobic terminology that could be a microaggression. Just people using words or biased phrases that demean folks who are in the LGBTQ community. So for example, when I was a teenager, it was pretty common for folks to say like, that's so gay about something that they found negative or didn't like. So that would be an example of that. And the last one I have here, an assumption of sexual pathology or abnormality. So it might be like assuming that LGBTQ folks are promiscuous or sexually deviant, predatory. So like, for example, you might hear people like expressing their discomfort with having a gay teacher, for example. Like they would say that they don't want a gay man working that closely with their kids. So just assuming some kind of sexual pathology or abnormality there. Then so there's also some microaggressions that particularly folks in the trans community might experience. And so these are all stem from this concept of cisnormativity, which basically just says that cisgender bodies, cisgender identities hold privilege in our society and in our culture. So examples of microaggressions that trans folks might experience. So just denial of individual transphobia. So this could be a cisgender person just denying that they're transphobic at all. So it could be, for example, like a gay man who says something like, how could I be transphobic? I'm gay. I know what it's like to be queer. So how could I also be transphobic? Also could be denial of bodily privacy. So often when folks meet somebody who's transgender, or even, when we talk about transgender folks in the media, there's lots of questions, inappropriate questions about like what genitalia they have, or have they had any surgery, like top surgery or anything like that. So just questions that probably aren't appropriate to ask somebody. Other microaggressions, just a lack of access to all gender public restrooms. So typically in most places, there's a men's restroom and there's a women's restroom. And so folks who are trans, particularly those who are non-binary, for example, they might experience anxiety or difficulties about which bathroom do they use. And you're probably familiar with how there's been lots of discussion about trans folks and bathrooms and the laws about that. Folks seem to always be very concerned about like a trans woman using the women's restroom, for example. There's also lots of transphobic policies in the criminal justice system. So for example, like a trans woman being sent to a men's prison would be an example of that. Also, and if you look at emergency healthcare, folks there might not be properly trained in how to work with trans patients. And there also can be lots of challenges and roadblocks, like financial issues that people might run into when trying to change their IDs that might have incorrect gender markers, or even things like changing their name. It can be really difficult to do that sometimes. And so these last four examples that I talked about, those would be more like systemic examples of microaggressions rather than those more like interpersonal, person-to-person microaggressions. Other microaggressions, and this is something that might be particularly experienced by non-binary folks, is just that presumption of the gender binary. So that we talked about, that most folks kind of just categorize people as male or female, or man or woman. So just presuming that that's how things work. So an example of that would just be like anytime a non-binary person goes to a clothing store, they're probably confronted with that, with there being a separate men's section and a separate women's section. People also might just be generally misidentified or miscategorized, and also just that use of incorrect gender pronouns. So just kind of small things that people might experience on a day-to-day basis that can just add up over time. It's sort of that idea of like death by 1,000 cuts. That things can just make life a lot harder and add up to just trauma for folks who experience these things often. So looking specifically at LGBTQ youth, youth in this population are particularly vulnerable and may experience pretty much all forms of trauma at higher rates than straight and gender conforming youth. They also might experience rejection, discrimination, and just overall marginalization that make them more vulnerable for trauma. So it's just a very vulnerable group. And so compared to straight and gender conforming folks, LGBTQ youth and young adults are more likely to meet criteria for PTSD. They are more likely to feel unsafe at school, also to be placed in a child welfare system and experience placement disruption, more likely to engage in risky behaviors, experience bullying, harassment, victimization, abuse, experience mental health issues like depression or suicidal ideation, and then also more likely to attempt suicide as well. So it's important to talk about this and also acknowledge that the systems that folks might turn to get help, so the resources, if they're unsupportive of LGBTQ identities, this can lead to discrimination and further harm or trauma. And it's also very important to acknowledge that social services do have a history of contributing to this and just offering culturally incompetent treatment to the community. So for example, going back to what I mentioned before about homosexuality being considered a mental illness until the 70s. So it's important to acknowledge that therapists, for example, they might cause harm by assuming somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity is the cause of all their clinical issues. So always trying to relate somebody's challenges or difficulties back somehow to them being gay, for example. They also just might make negative assumptions about them or just have general overall biases. And so an example of a heteronormative bias would just be that, assuming that every client who you meet with or every person that you meet is straight until you learn otherwise. And so LGBTQ folks, they might have a mistrust of traditional services, and they might not always feel comfortable coming out to their therapist, which can lead to even more distress and just an overall level lower quality of care if they feel like they're not able to be their true selves in that setting. And so it's really important for any kind of treatment to acknowledge that discrimination and oppression are the problems. It's not being LGBTQ that's the problem. It's the way that society and other folks respond to it that's the issue. So it's also very important that interventions like look at those examples of discrimination or oppression or the experiences that someone had, and also take it a step further and think about ways that those social inequities can be eliminated. So, so where does that leave us, and what are the recommendations based on all of that? So it's important that organizations or agencies, that they acknowledge this negative history and then take steps to move forward to building that trusting, honest, and open relationships with LGBT folks, and just really trying to rebuild and have that sense of safety and security for folks in these settings. And so LGBTQ consumers, they often, if they're like going to an agency or, checking them out on a website, for example, they will often look for signs or signals or other cues that tell them that they're accepting and affirming to folks in the LGBTQ community. So things that you can do. You can, like if you have an office or even like you put a sticker in the window outside of your agency, just ways of displaying that you are supportive of the LGBTQ community. So for example, in my office that I'm in right now, I have lots of pride flags displayed for the different LGBTQ identities. So it can just be very small things and make a difference. Just having like some kind of small rainbow flag item in your office, just to cue folks in, to let them know that you're supportive of folks in the community. Other things you can do is it's important to allow clients to self-define their identity and then invite them to discuss their personal understanding and their personal experience with it. It's also helpful to make sure that all staff are trained to avoid gender-specific language until a person has been asked for their name and pronouns. And then that would also include avoiding binary assumptions and language. So avoiding things like he, she, or calling somebody sir or ma'am until you know how they identify and what pronouns they use. And then also just asking for names and pronouns routinely, recognizing that somebody might shift on that maybe they felt comfortable when you first started meeting them with he, him pronouns, and maybe that changed over your time together and now they feel more comfortable with they, them pronouns, for example. So just making sure to check in with that, letting the person know that this is a safe space that they can openly share about that. And then also if you have the person's permission, sharing that with other staff members so that everybody can refer to them respectfully. Other recommendations, making sure that any intake forms that you use or other documents that have personal identifying information, just making sure that they're inclusive of all gender identities and sexual orientations. One way that this might come up, for example, is oftentimes like intake forms in the gender section. They'll have just a box that you can check, usually male or female. Sometimes there might be like an other box that somebody can check, and that's a step in the right direction. But really the easiest way that you can make sure you're inclusive with things like gender and sexual orientation, if you ask about that, is to just leave a blank line and have somebody fill it in however that works for them. Because even while it can be nice to see that there's a third option behind male or female, it doesn't always feel great to have to check a box other for an important or a big part of your identity. Other things is you can just make sure that you are aware of the locations of all gender restrooms, if you have any in the place in your agency or organization. And then also if somebody asks where a bathroom is, to list all of the options, because you don't want to assume which one they would feel most comfortable using. It's also just really important to make sure that you have non-discrimination policies that explicitly include sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression in them. And so you should make sure that you have those policies for clients or people you work with, but also staff and employees too. And then also just making sure that you have a zero tolerance policies around homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic language and behavior. So now some recommendations specifically directed towards youth. So things you can do, just making sure that you work with families to assess and then also address, if needed, their levels of acceptance of their LGBTQ youth, as just being rejected by your family or feeling uncomfortable around them. That can be a really big source shame or sadness, confusion, just can lead to a lot of negative feelings or negative experiences if you're rejected by your family. Schools, since obviously youth spend a lot of their time in schools, it's important that they be supportive and safe for LGBTQ youth. So things schools can do, they can create and then make sure that they enforce anti-bullying policies that specifically talk about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. They can work to identify faculty who are faculty and administrators who are safe and have had training in supporting LGBTQ students. And then also just taking steps to increase LGBTQ visibility in schools, just normalizing the community and identities as just certain aspects of who people are. So that could be making sure that your school has a group, the Gay Straight Alliance, which lots of schools across the country have that group. Making sure that there's positive representation of LGBTQ people and events in classes, and then also making sure that any sex education that the school offers is inclusive of LGBTQ folks and experiences. So lastly, I just want to talk about making mistakes. Because I think that a lot of times folks, they might have the best intentions and, they're supportive of folks in the community, but might be nervous that they're going to mess up or use the wrong pronouns, or if they're, the pronouns that somebody uses are maybe a little bit unfamiliar to you, you might avoid using them entirely because you don't want to make a mistake. So it's just important to just be honest about your mistakes if you make them, and just make sure that you demonstrate a willingness to learn and make changes. So it's perfectly fine to make mistakes as long as you're considerate to the person. If you acknowledge it, apologize, and then move on. So finally, conclusions. All of these recommendations or practices that I talked about, they can be implemented in any setting, and they don't really require like large-scale structural change or extensive detailed knowledge about sexual orientation or gender. They're just small things that you can do to make sure that the space that you work in or the space that you live in is supportive of folks who are in the LGBTQ community. So basically anybody can be prepared to be supportive and affirming of everyone, regardless of whether or not they've explicitly identified themselves as LGBTQ. All right. So that I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now if I can figure out how to do that.
Thank you so much, Kate. This information is invaluable. We appreciate you so much. I want to just take a minute really quick. We have someone listed that is present today. We want to make sure that you get credit for today. Your identity is listed as 817-297-5160. Appears to be a phone number. Might be not able to chat in the chat box. If you want to unmute yourself really quick, I just want to make sure you get credit for today. And we'll open it up to questions. 817-297-5160. All right, well, we'll open the floor for questions then. I'll ask a question, Kate.
Okay.
So we talked about making sure that we're using proper pronouns or, attempting to do so. How do you know when it is appropriate to ask someone what their pronouns are?
So it's something that you can do like when you first meet someone. For example, like if I introduce myself, so for example, I recently had a new neighbor who moved in upstairs. When we first met, I introduced myself. My name is Kate, and I use they, them pronouns. So if it's, but for folks who are maybe trans or non-binary or use different pronouns, then they might not always know, like, if you're a safe person to share their pronouns with. Um, so it's something that you can just kind of incorporate into like standard introductions that you do, or if you work in an agency or an organization, just including that. And as part of like intake paperwork, for example, like having a space where somebody can put their pronouns, but then also making sure that there's not an assumption that somebody has to share their pronouns or that it's required. Just going back to not everybody, they might not feel comfortable, or they might feel like they're having to out themselves when maybe they don't necessarily want to at that point.
Sure. So part of it is just making it, like you said, normalizing, so that every single time that we are introducing ourselves to someone, we could potentially be kind of, making that part of our introduction, because we would do that with anyone.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that that key word there is normalizing.
Yeah.
And if somebody who uses like they, them pronouns, for example, like I do, if somebody who I was meeting for the first time introduced themselves and said what pronouns they use, then that would probably cue me in that they're somebody who is open and affirming and supportive of folks like me. So I would probably feel then more comfortable sharing what pronouns I use.
Sure. Great. We do have a question in the chat box. When unaware of their pronouns at the moment, is it okay to use they, them? Thank you so much for the helpful presentation.
Yeah, I would, I guess this is probably, different people who you ask might give different responses. So I just want to preface this by saying that this would probably just be my opinion, but that they, them pronouns is probably a safe option to use when you don't know the pronouns that somebody uses. And it's something that we do all the time when we don't know like who the person is. So for example, like if you're somewhere and somebody left their jacket there, then you might say like, oh, somebody left their jacket here, because you don't know who did so. Using they, them pronouns is probably a good option if you don't know what pronoun somebody uses. But once you do find out, it would then be important to make sure that you do use the correct pronouns for them. Because, while using they, them pronouns can be more inclusive in that context of not knowing what pronouns somebody uses, it's also still misgendering. For example, if you use them for like a trans woman who uses she, her pronouns. It's a good question.
Any other questions? We have about 3 more minutes for anyone that may want to ask a question of Kate.
If there's time, I guess it's a big question, but I just really wanted to hear what you had to say. I work with juvenile court with a lot of youth. From a trauma perspective, like what can we do to support youth that aren't willing to come out because of the environment that they're in, but are still struggling with that, this is who I am, but I can't share it with any. So how can we go about supporting those kids?
Yeah, so I think that well, it's certainly challenging. I think that would kind of go back to some of those recommendations of just making sure that, there are things to cue them in that you're somebody who that if they feel comfortable, that you're somebody who they could be safe opening up to about that. So like if that's just having like, if you have an office where you're meeting with kids, like that's just having like pride flags around, or other things that just indicate that you're somebody who's supportive and affirming of folks in the LGBTQ community. And then, you know, if they did get to a point where they felt safe opening up to you, talking with them about that, and, you know, asking them, you know, well, maybe you feel safe talking to me. Are there other people in your life who, like, for example, your family, who you might feel less safe talking to about that? And what can we do to make sure that we are going to be safe? And what plan are we going to do? So, for example, like if somebody opened up to you about, well, I think I'm trans and I use she, her pronouns, but they don't feel comfortable sharing that with their family, then you would want to, you know, make an explicit plan about how, so when you and I are talking, then I'll make sure to refer to you in that way and to use the pronouns that you use. But if I'm talking to your family, then I'll still refer to you in this way. Or it could even be like if you document your time together, have like case notes, asking them how they would want you to refer to them in those notes or anything like that. Just making them a part of the process and making sure that they're comfortable with it.
All right, it is 4 o'clock. Just a reminder, if you haven't already, please type your first and last name in the chat box so that you can get credit for today. Kate, we appreciate you so much and your time and everything you had to share with us today. And we will let everyone go for the day. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.